Don Mazelli here again for Small Business Digest. We have a very interesting, actually two people on who've written a book, and I want to make sure we understand it. It's called Exit Right, and it's not political. It's about how you should be planning for your exit rather than which political party you want to join. So, without further ado, I'm going to welcome our two guests. And first is Mark Achler. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Mark Achler.
Did, yep.
Okay. And this is the hard one for me. It's Turkish, if I heard correctly, which is, anyway, I can tell you a story about Turkey. Everybody has one about Turkey. Anyway, Merk. Mert, you're going to have to pronounce your last name.
No problem at all, Don. Mert Iseri is my name. Born and raised in Turkey. Very excited to be here today.
Okay, well, we're going to start with you then. Tell us a little about your personal background, and then a little bit about your book. But before we do, we'll go back to Mark and ask about his background. So you start.
Sounds great. As I said, born and raised in Turkey. I came to Chicago to study engineering at Northwestern University. We share that with Mark as well. Mark teaches at Northwestern along his many other talents. But right after I left school, I started an organization called SwipeSense, a healthcare technology company aimed to reduce preventable medical errors inside hospitals. We had a roller coaster of a ride. We raised $24 million in venture. We scaled our solution up to above 100 hospitals, and we got successfully acquired by SC Johnson in March of 2020. Now, the process was challenging and tough, and it was my first company, so I didn't have a ton of experience in selling companies, even though we were a high growth startup. And I left in the end, while it was a good exit, it was good for our investors, it was good for us, it was good for the company. I felt like there were many steps along the way where I felt like I could have done better, where I could have been, the outcome could have been better. So we sort of got together. Mark has been a mentor of mine for a long time, and try to get our heads together in terms of how can we sort of like create a framework that helps founders essentially do this better. This isn't something you get many shots at, but that's sort of the story behind my background and sort of a little hint into how the book came together. Mark, I'd love to turn it over to you to hear your background as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Mert, and thank you, Don. My background is I'm a tech guy. So I started life at Apple Computer back in the day. I'm OG. I was at Apple in 1983, 84, 85. And I came back to Chicago where I became an entrepreneur. And I started 4 different companies, 4 different software technology companies. A couple of them did okay, one failed, one worked really well. It's the up and down of the entrepreneurial journey. And then along the way, I started a venture capital fund in the .com days, and also was part of the executive team at Redbox, where I headed up innovation at Redbox. And now I started another venture capital fund in 2014. And we invest in, it's called Math Venture Partners, and we invest in early stage software technology companies. And I'm also an adjunct professor at Northwestern University, their Kellogg School of Business.
Okay, that's the background. Now, the two of you have written a book. Tell us a little bit of the title, where people can get it, and what's your main thrust of the book?
Yeah, so the name of the book is Exit Right. It comes out on February 15th, and it's available where Amazon and bookstores and Barnes and Nobles and wherever you buy books, as well as our website, which is ExitRightBookcom, EXITRIGHT book.com. And the book is written for any entrepreneur who is thinking about selling their business. And it's really interesting. There's so many books out there about how to start a business, how to raise money, the messy middle, sales, marketing, culture. But there's very little out there in terms of how the art and the science of how to sell your business. And so we interviewed dozens of CEOs. We got some incredible stories. And we asked them all sorts of questions like, what do you know today that you wish you had known before you sold your business? And we talked to M&A attorneys, and we talked to bankers, and we talked to the heads of corp dev at all the major tech companies, the Apples and Microsofts and Facebooks and Googles of the world. And we got a very holistic view of a lot of collected wisdom about how to sell your business.
I'll build on what Marcus shared. There's a collective feeling that I believe every founder feels as they're selling their company, is that you feel like the odds are against you. Because the person that you're likely dealing with literally buys companies for the larger acquirer for a living. I mean, they'll do dozens, if not hundreds of deals across their career. And maybe the best founders will do 5 or 6. I mean, assuming you're a serial founder, you get to that level, maybe 5, 6 deals, maybe 10 if you're amazing. So there's this huge gap between people who do this professionally versus the founders who are, focused on growing their business, as they should be. You should be building a great business in order for it to be getting acquired one day. But the sentiment remains the same. You're here, it's a life-changing transaction, a life-changing moment, not just in dollars and cents. This really is the initiation from sort of a bright-eyed junior entrepreneur into someone who's made it, someone who is now sort of in the promised land of like, hey, I built, raised, scaled, and successfully exited a startup. That's a big moment for every founder, and hopefully one that our listeners and our readers will live many, many times over. But nonetheless, a price of a mistake is quite high. When you're trying to sell your company, you say you're something you're not supposed to, or you over-negotiate a point that really didn't matter in the long run. The price can be millions of dollars in your pocket. And this is, it's quite a heavy burden to carry on your shoulder. So the spirit that we wrote this book was essentially, this was the book we wish we read before we sold our companies, before we, went through and got the hard-earned lessons over the many, many years of our careers. Obviously, Mark, much more so than I am. Don't be confused by his youthful looks. He's been doing this for many, many years. But the motivation behind this is this: level the playing field. Get on the same page and hopefully build these partnerships that look less like a short-term transaction, but much more of a long-term forces coming together to build something phenomenal.
Okay, let's stop there. And in a short time, what is the most glaring thing that happens the first-time sellers that you've discovered?
Well, there's a long list there. I have a lot of scar tissue of mistakes made in the past. I'll pick a few. So the first is, make sure you hire the best professionals to help you and represent you. So I'll be specific. There are attorneys, you maybe have a wonderful business attorney, just a general business attorney. Maybe it's your cousin or your uncle or your nephew, and they're a fine business attorney, but the precise skills of M&A, of mergers and acquisitions, when it's time to sell your business, you really want the best, most experienced service provider you possibly can. Whether it's your attorney or your tax professional, the mistakes, the knowledge that is so precise and specific to an acquisition. Not all service providers, not all attorneys, not all accountants are as well versed. I'll give you an example. If you were having a surgery, would you want to have the doctor who does it once every few years, or would you want the one who does 100 a year? Like you want the service provider who really knows is on top of their game.
But how do
That's
you
what-
identify that person?
Well, first of all, it's fairly straightforward to see who's doing the transactions, the number of transactions. That information is public. But I also, you go to your investors, you look at who's highly recognized, who's written a lot of articles about the subject. Mert, what do you think?
I believe the process here is straightforward. Treat it as if it's a job interview, and this is all about parallel processes. Ask the lawyer that you're working with the last 10 technology startups that they've represented in acquisitions that we can read press releases about. Again, you don't need to say, hey, give me the all the confidential information that happened in them, but they should be able to point to literal online web announcements of like, hey, I was representing the buyer, I was representing the seller, here was the transaction, here is how the process went start to finish, and maybe give 3 examples of conflict and how they were able to navigate that along with the founder and the buyer. A great acquisition sometimes isn't the simplest acquisition. You might have to overcome some challenges. And this is essentially the core of what you're trying to interview with a buyer and with a legal representative or an M&A banker or a tax representation that's working through with it. So treat it as if it's a job interview.
And I would also add, we're big believers in empathy. The more time you spend with the acquiring company and take the time to truly understand the rationale. Why is that company buying you? What are they buying? And what is the hidden value? Because oftentimes entrepreneurs undervalue their company. They're looking backwards, not forwards. They're looking backwards, what's their EBITDA or what is their top line revenue? But what they're not doing is they're not building that rationale. They're not taking the time to understand if it's a strategic investment. Why is the acquirer buying them? And what is the value to the acquirer? So that is also really, really important.
Now, one last detail I'll add to the typical things that first-time founders get wrong is they view it as an awkward topic to talk about with their internal stakeholders. Whether it's their team, whether it's their board, whether it's their investors, exits today are somewhat of a taboo. I mean, the name implies itself, right? It's called an exit. It feels like you're getting out. It feels like maybe I'm not happy here. If you bring up like, hey, maybe it's time for an exit. We think it's a wrong framing. And we wish, through our book and some of the practices that we recommend inside ExitRight, folks start having a slightly different approach to this. What we recommend is founders start having an annual exit talk. An exit talk with your board where it's a predetermined agenda item and you sit down and you have an open conversation. Where is everybody at? What is the timing around our eventual sale? What is the threshold price? What is a rationale that makes sense strategically that we should start planting the seeds from today? Right now, unfortunately, the stigma is if you start bringing up the subject to begin with, people assume that you don't have motivation to keep going for a long time. And this is just couldn't be further from the truth. An exit should be a thoughtful, planned, strategic event versus something that just sort of happenstance is akin to you winning the lottery. And even going further than that, I think, founders have this immense aversion to talk about an exit with their, say, leadership teams, let alone the broader team members. And I think it's because obviously you want the team to be focused, especially the leadership to be focused on creating value for their customers. But we believe there's a way to do this without saying, hey, we're going to sell and everybody's going to make this much money on the way out. Maybe the conversation is much better had around how can we create more impact for our customers? What is a partnership that makes sense for our customers that we can't get to ourselves? Mark, would love to hear your thoughts on this sort of annual transparency and exit talk concepts.
Well, I love the concept of an annual exit talk because it also helps to not only align all the parties, it also helps to optimize for the exit. So, for example, if an acquirer is a strategic acquirer, and what are they carrying? Do they care about top line revenue? Do they care about profitability and EBITDA? Do they care about intellectual property? If you're thoughtful and you can plan far enough out in advance, you can start turning the knobs a little bit so that 18 months ahead of where you think an acquisition, you might be ready. If you think who's the more likely acquirer, you can start to turn the knobs to be that much more attractive. And the other thing that we really believe in is taking a long-term point of view. Many people think of an exit or an acquisition as the end of the road. We actually think it's just one step in a much longer process. For most entrepreneurs, and we tend to live in the technology world, so entrepreneurs tend to be younger at times, there's going to be another company. And so the question we ask is, will your investors want to invest in you again? Will your employees want to follow you to your next company? Will the acquiring company, will the head of biz dev at the acquiring company want to buy your next company? What kind of a person are you? What kind of relationships? And we tend to take a much longer term point of view and perspective on the importance of your legacy and the relationships. It's not just one moment in time.
I'm going to interrupt you here for gentlemen. First off, your website.
Yeah, ExitRightBook.com.
Okay, spell it out for our audience. One more.
Yeah, so exit, EXIT, right, RIGHT, book, BOOK.com.
You may sound silly to you, but this program, that's important.
No, we agree.
Okay, but I'm going to say most of my audience is 100 under 100 employees. Okay, and they tend not to be in the technical side. For instance, in one of our recent surveys, we found that we skew older to people who are looking at exiting their company because their children don't want to participate. Can you kind of make your pitch a little bit towards them? Because you're talking, I think there's a world of difference between the software world and this and the older people who have built up companies. And we're told in our surveys that the toughest thing they have to do is letting go because they've been there so long. So I'm going to stop there.
It's their baby.
Yes.
Of course, it's hard to let go. You've spent your life building up something. And it's not just your life, it's all the stakeholders. It's your customers, it's your employees, it's your suppliers. I mean, this is your life, it's your baby. Well, one of the things that we talk about that we believe is relevant and applicable to everybody, to all business holders, is when we think of an acquisition, we came up with a framework that we call FAIR, which is fit, alignment, integration, and rationale. And it's a framework for any business owner to think about what would the best transaction look like. Mert, do you want to dig in on that one?
Absolutely. And I think this is a particularly important point for our listeners, perhaps the source of the anxiety that every founder feels, whether this is your first tech startup or this is a family-owned business that you ran for 50 years, is you kind of want to know what happens after the exit. You want to know, like, the folks who are taking on your legacy, your dream, your vision, your hard work, continue to honor it the same way that you would. So the framework that we created really is the right exit. It's sort of our clues into how you can sort of predict the future around whether this is going to indeed lead to the great outcome that you're looking for outside of just sort of a cash payout. It's sort of like, is this the right home for the business, for the customers, for the employees? And the framework FAIR really sort of like think of it as a checklist. Fit as in cultural fit. Do we have cultural fit between our worldview and the acquirer's worldview. This is an important point, both in terms of the sort of the ease of working together, but also sort of a giant checkbox in whether your team is able to going to be function in the acquiring team's broader team. And this is so much easier to do if there's pre-existing fit between the two companies. Otherwise, the larger company that's enveloping the smaller company will eventually lead to conflict, or or force their culture on the newer company. We see a lot of examples around this in large acquisitions, small acquisitions, but it's maybe as simple as, can you sit down next to the person that's leading the acquisition in an airplane for 4 hours and get off the plane having totally had a great time? If you can't, maybe this is something to look deeper into. The next is alignments. Alignments of internal stakeholders, like, are you aligned with your board, with your employees, with your customers? And is the buyer aligned internally within themselves? Is the CFO looking the same direction as the chief executive officer? A lot of times alignment is difficult because there's so many stakeholders around a transaction. It's not just, one person negotiating with another one. There's many, many moving parts, and being intentional about that alignment process is absolutely critical. Again, it looks to not just what is aligned today, but where the puck is going. Are we aligned in the strategic direction that we both set out to be? Third is integration. Again, a key mistake that we see, folks leave the integration plan of how these two businesses are going to come together, how they're going to start delivering more value for their future customers. They leave that after the acquisition. We believe it's the wrong strategy. We believe the integration conversation happens prior to the exit, where clear resources are allocated, clear understanding of timelines are discussed beforehand. The sort of a failed version of this integration looks like company gets acquired, 2 years pass, and it still feels like two separate companies. It still feels like these are entities kind of doing their own thing. Whereas with a thoughtful integration plan, there is a ticking clock that brings these forces together in a much more predictable manner. And then and only then, there's the final point, which is the rationale. What is the greater garden that we're trying to cultivate? What is the greater impact for our customers that we can deliver as a result of these two companies coming together? And that sort of becomes the driving motivator for the fit and the alignment and the integration to sort of be put together. If the rationale is strong enough, then you will have all of these elements. And again, the output of this isn't just fetch the highest price for your company for the exit. It's much more about, let's make sure that this business has found its permanent long-term home, with an eye towards realizing that the final rationale. And the rationale, if it's framed around a better future for your customers, that's something that you can get really, really excited about and get behind. Mark, what do you think?
Well, I'm going to interrupt both of you in the interest of time, because I got a specific example. But first, again, your website for our audience?
ExitRightBook.com. ExitRightBook.com. ExitRightBook.com.
Okay. I sat on the board of a company that was being sold. And I said to the board, of course, that this company will eliminate all the jobs once they get control. And the other board members said, so what? What? Okay. And indeed, that's what happened. Within 6 months, everybody at most levels were gone. But what do you recommend in that case? I mean, that's a true story, by the way.
Of course, it happens all the time, especially if you're buying, if the acquirer is a financial acquirer, and they're just trying to optimize.
No, it was a manufacturing company.
Oh, a manufacturing company. Yeah, it happens. And so when you sell, when a business owner is selling, the question is, what's really important to them? What do they care about? If all they care about, and the board of directors and investors care about, is optimizing the sale price to get the absolute most amount of money up front, well, then that's what they care about. If they care about your customers and the customers having a good experience, if they care about the employees, if they care about what happens post-transaction, then that's part of the conversation that needs to take place before the transaction, not afterwards.
But
And
should the board be concerned for their employees?
Well, the board has a fiduciary responsibility to maximize return to all shareholders, first and foremost. That said, every company's different. I personally believe, from a values perspective, that the board of directors does have a response, in addition to a fiduciary responsibility. They also have a responsibility to make sure that the business is taken care of, that the employees are taken care of, that the customers are taken care of, and that you talk about the board. Ultimately, it comes down to the CEO. At the end of the day, it's the CEO's job it's a balancing act, because they have, how much money goes to the executive team, how much money goes to investors or shareholders, how much do they take care of the employees. Once again, if you're taking a short-term perspective, the short-term point of view, it's a zero-sum game, and I want to maximize what we get today. If you're taking a longer-term perspective and you care about relationships and you think those relationships are going to transcend time, then, I tend to think that the CEO has a greater responsibility than just in addition to maximizing return to shareholders, but they also have to balance the needs of multiple stakeholders.
Absolutely.
Agreed.
The long-term view here is this. Would the employees want to work for the CEO / founder, operator, entrepreneur? Would they want to work for them again in a future company? If they're treated right, and every employee is treated fairly as a result of the exit and the acquisition, every people have ownership stake in the company, and it's a positive event. People made money as a result of this transaction. Even if they don't have a job 3 months down the road, maybe they'll be thrilled to join the CEO again in the next adventure. This is all a matter of having this being done with the long-term perspective in mind. And I think this is really, really important. We believe CEOs should have a spine. We believe that if you're not aligned, that this is not the fair transaction for your company, eventually there's going to be a better home, someone who's willing to pay a higher price, someone who's willing to value the team as well as the IP and the technology, then you have a responsibility to respectfully push back on your board and say, hey, not now. I understand your desire to have an exit, but here are the things that I really, really care about. And at that point, the board has a choice. The board can say, hey, you're not aligned with the shareholders and you shouldn't be the CEO anymore. But wouldn't you rather have that honest and open conversation versus pretending that alignment was already there? So this isn't an easy thing to do. I want to underscore this. And we're not presented with an easy dilemma here. Do I dare disturb the universe? Do I dare stand up to the board? But we believe the respect that a CEO has amongst their team, that is a sacred trust. That is a sacred bond that really needs to be honored, regardless of what one board member thinks about a particular transaction. I mean, this is tens, if not hundreds of folks that are showing up every day and delivering value towards the mission of the company. We don't believe it's as simple as they paid us the highest price, let's go. We're firing everybody in 2 months. It takes more than that.
And you also, go ahead, Don, please.
No, I'm sorry. We're running out of time. I have to ask each of you to, what would you like to leave in about a minute with our audience?
This book was a labor of love, and we put it together really in the spirit of giving first. Both Mark and I are experienced operators, and frankly, up front, we thought this was going to be an exercise of documenting what we already know. It couldn't be further from what actually happened. We learned so much from folks around the table, extremely thoughtful partners, large buyers, people who do this for a living in Facebook, Google, Amazon, folks who've been operated family businesses over many, many years, as well as really seasoned, experienced professionals around law, around banking, advising, you name it. The book is the hard-earned lessons around what folks collectively paid decades to earn. It's our joy to have put it together, and we really hope that one of our readers who, after reading this book, finds a right home for their business. That would make us the happiest, and this is what I would love to leave our listeners with.
Yeah, and we would invite the listeners, if you read the book and something helps you, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your stories about if you got a nugget of wisdom that came out of the book, how it impacted you. We would love to hear from you.
Do you have an email on your website? How do they do that?
There is a contact us button on the website. It goes directly to our inboxes, and we would love to hear from folks who have questions or feedback or thoughts around Exit Right.
Well, on that note, we have to say thank you for a very illuminating time.